introduce myself. My name's Clive Carpenter. I'm a chartered hydrogeologist. I have more than 20 years experience in that. And about 10 years ago, I put my foot on the other side of the fence and started working in more mainstream water and sanitation from an international development perspective. I now routinely work in project design, project implementation, and monitoring and evaluation of other people's projects. So for UNICEF, I'll be going off to the Solomon Islands shortly. Nearly everything I do now is through the prism of climate change adaptation, which is what Guy mentioned earlier, and I think we would do well to mention this. My presentation is trying to get you guys to think a little bit beyond, hopefully, what you've heard already, which is a lot about groundwater resources and a lot about how good hydrogeology feeds into good borehole design. There is a bit more that us hydrogeologists can do to contribute to WASH programs, as has been alluded to by a couple of other people. So I am the old soapbox, I suppose. 4 or 5 slides I'm going to put up in front of you, which you can read yourself. But basically, I want us to try and think a bit more in an integrated manner across the different aspects of WASH. Groundwater is great. This is a quote from Alan MacDonald, who was standing up here a few years ago, giving some obvious reasons why groundwater is important. And these you can read for yourself. If you're a hydrogeologist, you will know this already. If you're not and you're more a WASH practitioner, some of this may be obvious, but you may not have thought so much. It has some advantages, groundwater. It's more widely available, certainly spatially, than surface water, which means that you need less infrastructure. If you have water points, walking times are reduced, and we know this affects children's education. It reduces the amount of wasted time, and there's a certain amount of gender discrimination that goes along with collection in rural water. So there are some issues that relate to gender and to safety as well. We know that aquifers transmit a lot of water, so communities can benefit from groundwater even if the recharge is not going into the ground near where they are. And we know that aquifers store a lot of water. So usually this is many, many altitudes of more than 1 year's worth of recharge. In some situations it's obviously less, but this does mean that generally they are less, there's less seasonal variation than with respect to surface water, which means they are generally more drought resilient. It also means that the not insignificant costs of water storage, whether that's rainwater harvesting or something more substantial from rivers, is largely avoided. Some of the other benefits, which again hydrogeologists will know, is that aquifers to some extent provide some treatment of water, and the microbiological quality is nearly always better than surface water, but of course there are exceptions, and that aquifers provide a certain amount of protection from superficial contamination, certainly with respect to surface waters. What I did want to bring up, kind of jumping across the fence a little bit, is that as hydrogeologists, and I suppose I'm especially talking to the younger members of the audience who are interested in getting into this kind of work, there are certain things that you should be aware of. If you can understand the international development policy and your own specific intervention context, you'll have a much better understanding of what you're doing, why you're there, and perhaps what's wrong with the terms of reference you've been given. There are several types of intervention. Some are led by the country, some are community driven, and some may be actually driven from a donor perspective. And there are usually 2 types of intervention. Some are paid for by loans and some are paid for by grants. Most countries will not want to service a loan that is spending money on capacity building or on water governance, institutional reforms, these types of issues. So those tend to be funded under grants. The European Union is a good example of that kind of mechanism, which means that the loans, which are usually from the international finance institutes, World Bank, ADB, and so on, they will tend to focus on infrastructure, which means that project designs tend to focus on these separate components. They might have smaller aspects of the other within them, but quite often you will find certainly a bank design project will focus strongly on the infrastructure, putting it in place, and will have lesser resources that are committed to developing the capacity building to either run those systems, and certainly with respect to the water management. The second point, and this has been raised, and Guy raised this early on in the day, was that we're starting to see less and less single sector approaches in terms of international development. They tend to be much more multi-sectoral or cross-sectoral. So tends to be a focus on disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, of which WASH is an important constituent, but it may be only a part of it, and it may be the project's not even framed within that kind of context. Climate change adaptation clearly is linked to some of these other things. It's clearly linked to disaster risk reduction, certainly in terms of cyclones, droughts, flooding, and so on. Sustainable land management is another example of that. Integrated water resources management is a terminology that's bandied around a lot and includes all of those things that have been mentioned already. And just bringing it down to perhaps a more community level scale, livelihood security, which obviously includes having a good water supply, is only one component of what a project might be looking at. It might be looking at irrigation, and there were some comments earlier from the floor about irrigation and agriculture that hardly mentioned at all. And ultimately, these are also tied up into income generation as well. So an intervention or a project or a program design may have a top-down type of modality to it. If it's coming in from government, a lot of the international finance institutes, they have to go through the Ministry of Finance. It's a requirement. Some of the NGOs may completely circumvent the government machine, perhaps for good reasons, perhaps not, and attempt to work directly with communities. And if you're aware of these, then even as a hydrogeologist, you understand whether it's going to be more complicated for you to link through to whichever ministry is responsible for water, or whether actually that's the route you're obliged to go through. Development agencies, not so much IFIs, but development agencies such as UNICEF and others, they will have different modalities, and we've heard quite a lot about partnership as well, which is clearly the ideal way to go ahead. WASH, sometimes, certainly UNICEF refers to WASH as having three pillars. The enabling environment, which obviously includes the policies, the institutions, the various plans within the country. If as a hydrogeologist you understand what these are, you're in a much better position to plug into that environment, and that helps with the sustainability of the project. If you try and do the project in isolation from what else is happening in the country, the chances of it being sustained are much less. Behavioural change is the second pillar, which obviously is relating to the community and the need, and I think we heard someone speaking earlier about behavioural change as it relates to hygiene. This is something as hydrogeologists you also have to plug into, especially if you want to start to talk to communities about groundwater protection and the way that they're going to be looking after the land around boreholes. The third one, water and sanitation services, is much more of an infrastructure focus. I will actually, just on that subject of behavioural change, I'll just bring you back to this photo. This is a Mani Arbour. This is a meeting hall in Kiribati, which is an atoll island state in the Pacific. In this corner here, you can see a glass box, which is actually a fish tank. It's got sand in it, and underneath is a bucket. And this was our way of trying to describe to the community how rainfall, we've got a watering can, how rainfall will percolate down through the sands underneath their feet, and how the water, the fresh water, collects within the sands, or from their point of view, below their feet. To try and get them to understand the link between what they were doing on the surface and how they can affect the groundwater quality. And we put some dye in here, put a watering can on top of it, or put some water in, and it came through, and they could see it coloured. It coloured the water in the bucket. That's a very simple thing to do, but before we came up with this idea, this is a community that does not use the written word in almost any sense. There's no cultural connection with the written word. Trying to get them to understand that, just talking to them, without having this, was almost impossible. So these ideas about hydrogeology building into behavioural change as well is important. Do I have to go? Okay, right. So then I run through these headings rather than anything else. I wanted to talk briefly about hydrogeology and how it influences water supply design, how it does and should influence sanitation, and how it has a contribution to hygiene. Groundwater has a specific role in terms of design because it has a specific role to play within drought. Rainwater harvesting usually will run out within 1 or 2 months. Even communal systems, that may be a little bit longer. Streams of rivers, depends where you are in the world, obviously, but they can still run dry within 6 months. So groundwater becomes more important during drought periods, and communities become more reliant upon groundwater during dry periods, which means that when we're looking at developing or designing groundwater supplies, you shouldn't just be thinking about the here and now, but you should be thinking about will it operate during drought periods, and in fact, will it have a greater demand upon it than during non-dry periods? And that isn't just about getting the boreholes or the technology in the right location. Maybe it means the boreholes need to be deeper, maybe they need to have greater diameter, maybe they need to allow for greater well yields. There may be water quality issues that come into play. A lot of what I do is in small island states, and so we started to introduce the idea of infiltration galleries, which some of you will be familiar with, which is basically a trench which is skimming fresh water off the freshwater lens, because it enables the fresh water to be provided in over much longer periods and sustained periods of drought. Groundwater is also perhaps preferentially more important during other types of disasters, other emergency situations, where surface waters get polluted just by the damage associated with the emergency. You get high sedimentation associated with cyclones, landslides, volcanic eruptions. Surface water supplies have more infrastructure, so that gets damaged, and groundwater sources have a tendency to be powered locally, or they're completely manual. So groundwater sources are generally more resilient. Yes, all right. These slides are up outside. So have a look at them. There is a role for hydrogeology and sanitation. Obviously, there's the issues of groundwater pollution and trying to avoid that. But we've also heard elsewhere that groundwater can be used, which is not potable, but it can be used for sanitation purposes. You don't need to have potable water for those uses. And if you can reduce fresh water usage for wastewater, you can very significantly reduce the demand on the freshwater resources. Hygiene, again, obviously the way a borehole is constructed, there are ways that hydrogeologists can contribute to hygiene, but also there are the issues of land use around them. Using very simple artificial recharge techniques to get excess rainfall that's not going into a rainwater tank into the ground, something that's not often thought of, but it's very obvious. There's a role for hydrogeologists in even household scale groundwater augmentation. This is, I think, the last slide, but it comes back to please ask you to think imaginatively. Someone else was talking about, try and look at the possibilities. There's a role in water supply, in sanitation, in hygiene. Think robustly. Look at the ways that there are different water demands, and can they be separated out? Does that influence the way that we look at exploiting the water resources? Rainwater, there is a hydrogeological aspect to this in terms of you can put it in the ground. Surface water and flood waters, ditto. And the extremes, droughts, floods, storms, and other types of emergencies, these tend to fit in within this increasingly important context, which is that of climate change adaptation. That's all right, I'm done.